Imagine spending almost an entire year fighting a war without knowing that the war had already ended. The story of the last stand of the Philippines begins in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. Spain was losing its colonies in the Pacific and the Caribbean. After the defeat in the naval battle of Cavite, control of the Philippines was quickly collapsing. In that context, a small detachment of 50 Spanish soldiers was sent to the village of Baler, located in a remote region of the island of Luzon. The mission was simple: to resist and hold the position until orders were received from the superior command. The group, led by Captain Enrique de las Morenas, arrived in Baler in June 1898. Shortly after, the Filipino Revolutionary Forces, known as the Tagalogs, surrounded the village. The detachment decided to fortify themselves in the local church, a stone structure with thick walls they considered defensible. The first attack by the Tagalogs was fierce. The siege began with rifle fire and light artillery. Despite their numerical superiority, the Filipinos failed to take the church, as the defenders had prepared barricades and strategic positions inside the building. The church quickly transformed into an improvised fortress. They used benches, tables, and other furniture to build barricades at the windows and doors. Additionally, they dug trenches inside to protect themselves from enemy bullets and grenade shrapnel thrown by the besiegers. The defenders maintained a strict military routine. Each day they carried out maintenance tasks, such as reinforcing the defenses, rationing food, and tending to the wounded. The nights were the most dangerous, with surprise attacks and constant fire from the outside. In the early months, the Filipinos attempted several times to assault the church through frontal charges. But the narrow streets of Baler and the uneven terrain put them at a disadvantage against the Spanish Mauser rifles. Every attempt by the Tagalogs was repelled with numerous casualties. As time passed, the Filipinos changed their strategy. They began to build trenches and parapets around the church, gradually closing in to reduce the maneuvering space of the Spanish. The besieged soon realized they were completely surrounded. To counter the situation, the defenders opened holes in the church walls, creating hidden firing points from which they could cover the perimeter without exposing themselves. The defense was now led by Lieutenant Saturnino Martin Cerezo, who took command after Captain de las Morenas died of illness. Martin Cerezo stood out for his tactical ability and for maintaining discipline. Under his command, the defenders devised a rotating guard system to ensure that the church was protected 24 hours a day. The soldiers were also trained to react quickly to any enemy movement. As the months went by, the siege turned into a war of attrition. The besiegers cut off any access to fresh food and supplies. The defenders, increasingly desperate, were forced to hunt rats and eat any grass they found in the church's small garden. The sanitary conditions inside the building deteriorated rapidly. The lack of potable water led to the spread of diseases such as dysentery and scurvy. The place became a focus of infections, with sick soldiers barely able to hold their weapons. Despite the conditions, the defenders clung to the hope of receiving help from the outside. They had heard rumors that the Spanish army was organizing a counterattack to liberate Baler, but these rumors never materialized. Spain had lost complete control of the Philippines. During the first 6 months, the Filipinos tried to undermine the besieged's morale. They sent written messages informing them of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war and ceded the Philippines to the United States. The Spaniards, believing it was a trick, destroyed each message without hesitation. Even the local newspapers they threw over the church with news of the surrender were considered enemy propaganda. Martin Cerezo ordered his men not to be influenced. For them, the war was not yet over. The siege intensified when the Filipinos brought in reinforcements. Bamboo palisades and trenches were built just meters from the church. The defenders found themselves under constant fire. Any attempt to peer out meant almost instant death. The besiegers also began to use new tactics. At night, they tried to set the church on fire by throwing torches and incendiary projectiles. The defenders responded with buckets of water and wet blankets to extinguish the flames before they spread. On one occasion, the Filipinos dug a tunnel under the church, intending to place explosives and blow it up. The Spaniards, alerted by the noise, countered by digging parallel tunnels to intercept the attackers and thwart their attempts. Every movement of the besieged was meticulously planned. They had an internal signaling system to communicate without speaking, using knocks on the wall and light movements. Everything was designed to minimize casualties and maintain vigilance in every corner of the building. Food became a torment. The Spanish soldiers rationed rice to a single spoonful per person daily. Hunger drove some to eat leather and roots. Despite the situation, no one spoke of surrendering. The lack of ammunition was another major problem. The defenders began to collect the enemy bullets that hit the walls and reuse them. The cartridges were manually refilled, and the deformed bullets were reshaped so they could be fired again. The Filipinos tried several times to negotiate a surrender. They sent priests and local mediators to speak with the Spaniards, but Martin Cerezo rejected every offer. He insisted that he would only obey direct orders from the Spanish command. The defenders also dealt with desertion. A group of soldiers tried to escape at night, but were discovered and killed by the Filipinos. From that moment on, Martin Cerezo imposed even stricter rules to prevent panic from spreading. The physical and psychological toll was extreme. The letters and messages from the Filipinos grew increasingly desperate. They offered the Spaniards their lives, food, and a safe return to Spain, but the defenders still considered everything to be a deception. By December 1898, the Spaniards were at their lowest point. More than half of the garrison was either sick or wounded. Even so, the resistance continued. The Tagalogs, frustrated, began to reduce their attacks, hoping that the Spaniards would surrender from exhaustion. However, the spirit of resistance prevailed. To boost his men's morale, Martin Cerezo would recount stories of past battles, evoking honor and duty. He said their names would be remembered as examples of courage and sacrifice, although no one seemed to believe it at the time. One of the most critical moments occurred when the defenders, desperate for food, devised a risky operation to search for supplies in the nearby village. Stealthily, they managed to steal some provisions from the enemy, risking their lives to bring some sustenance back to the garrison. These kinds of actions kept morale high for a time. But the real turning point came when the Filipinos, seeing that they could not break the Spaniards by force, began to employ more subtle psychological tactics. In April 1899, the Filipinos devised a maneuver that nearly ended the resistance. A messenger entered the church and, with a calm voice and carefully chosen words, described day-to-day life in Madrid, narrating recent events as if they had happened that same week. He spoke of political changes and new royal decrees, details that matched the dates, which sowed doubt among some defenders. Martin Cerezo, however, stood firm. He dismissed the account as a ruse and issued a clear order. No man should listen more than necessary. The lowest point of the resistance occurred in May, when the last food supplies were completely exhausted. There were no more rats nor roots to eat. Some defenders began to show signs of madness, delirious from hunger and despair, but discipline prevailed. Martin Cerezo, in an unquestionable display of leadership, established a shift plan in which each soldier rested for short periods to avoid mental fatigue and physical collapse. Finally, when the official order of surrender arrived, bearing the signature of the Queen Regent and Spanish authorities, the lieutenant accepted reality. They had resisted to the limit of their strength. The Spanish flag flew over the church tower for the last time. The day the church doors opened, the defenders marched out in formation, despite being weakened. The Filipinos, impressed by their resistance and discipline, received them without firing a single shot. To everyone, they were no longer enemies, but soldiers deserving of respect. The Filipino soldiers offered food and medical attention to the survivors. Many of the defenders were so weakened that they could barely stand. Some cried upon seeing food in abundance after months of deprivation. After the end of the siege, Martin Cerezo was brought before the Tagalog chief. There, he was offered the chance to pay tribute to the fallen Filipinos, and he, in turn, asked permission to bury his fallen comrades in the small local cemetery. The Tagalog chief agreed, and a brief but emotional funeral was held. The Filipinos, moved by the defenders' strength, offered a safe passage for the survivors to return to Manila without being attacked. The remaining men, exhausted and dejected, embarked on the long journey back to the Philippine capital. Upon reaching Manila, the news of the siege's end had spread. The defenders were received as heroes by the local Spanish authorities and the community. However, They also found a country that did not fully understand the sacrifice they had made. Of the 50 men who arrived in Baler, only 35 came out alive. Many of them were so affected by the experience that they never fully recovered. Even so, each of them was decorated and recognized for their bravery. The Church of Baler, which was their prison and fortress for 337 days, became a symbol. Today, it is a pilgrimage site for those who seek to understand the resistance of a small group of soldiers trapped in time and in a conflict that had already ended. The Siege of Baler is remembered as the last significant action of the Spanish forces in the Pacific. A small group of men who, unknowingly, fought beyond duty and logic, standing firm in their convictions. This story is not just a war tale. It is a testament to the human spirit in extreme situations. The last stand of the Philippines resisted until the end, turning their suffering into a legacy that endures as a symbol of resilience and loyalty to an ideal. When they said farewell to their Filipino captors, the latter accompanied them to the coasts of the Philippines. The mutual respect between besiegers and besieged was palpable. The war had ended, but the memory of those days remained etched in the minds of all present. Upon their return to Spain, the survivors were received with military honors and a grand ceremony. However, the shadow of the conflict and the loss of the Philippines marked their lives. Some never found their place in society again. Martin Cerezo published a book in which he narrated the experience at Baler, defending the decision to resist until the last moment. In it, he described in detail the tactics, daily hardships, and the incredible will of his men not to give up. The story of the last stand of the Philippines has become a legend, an episode that shows the limits of human resistance in desperate circumstances and how, in a forgotten corner of the world, a small group of soldiers defied the course of history.